we're going to talk about one of those nutrients of life for poultry or humans or whatever that maybe is overlooked a little. And so we are going to have some tales from the pipe of all about water and life. Perry Kaita from Steinbach Hatcheries and Art Van Zanten from Trow Nutrition are going to share some very interesting case studies that they encountered on the road, and then we'll talk a little bit about water and maybe how it's been overlooked and what it can cause. So here's our presentations.
Hi, my name is Perry Kaita. I'm the general manager of Steinbach Hatchery, situated in Steinbach, Manitoba. As the title of the talk is entitled, with the water being the main aspect of what we're going to be talking about, I have a couple of case studies that how do we get to that point. There is certainly a practical method to being able to figure out what's sometimes going on in our flocks. Tales from the pipe. My talk is about water being cheap yet potentially costly in the case where we do have issues. I do not claim to be an expert on water. I do not have a bunch of letters behind my name saying that I'm an expert on water, but at the same time, I am a service person that has a lot of experience in trying to figure out what goes on some of our farms. And I do love to learn, which means I spend a lot of time with webinars or talking to people so you can learn from their experience, or doing some research on the internet, and then taking that and applying it in a practical way. Water is one of our cheapest inputs, besides air, of course, but water, like air, is essential for life to exist. Through hunger strikes, we can see that as humans, we can live longer without food, but you go a few days without water and you will tend to perish fairly quickly. We require good water to live and thrive. Because birds are an integral part to a lot of our operations, for them to be able to thrive, they should actually be getting as good water as what we would drink, if not even better, because it is their only source. We have different sources as humans that we can rely on. So one of the practical ways to figuring out problems is to run through flaws, which a lot of management guides use and outline. Feed, light, air, water, and if you can go in that order, generally you'll be able to get to figuring out what the problem is. The feed needs to be of good quality and balanced, especially for the type of operation that we have and the type of livestock. Certainly free run needs something a little bit different than cages, or broilers need something different from broiler breeders. So we have to make sure everything is balanced. Light is a whole completely different talk on its own, especially when you get into LEDs and their spectrums and how they compare to fluorescence and incandescence and so forth. Air, of course, depending on the age of the bird with the temperature, is very critical. Water has to be of good quality and clean. And I think we've all seen that the water coming into the barns is generally very clean. So, but problems can still exist afterwards. So in my first case study, I had a pullet barn that, for tracking with it a number of years, that there had been higher than normal mortality on every flock. It was an older barn with a lower ceiling, and then with cages that came up, so there was very little space on top for the air to move across the top of the cages. Because of this, the light bulbs were actually lower in the cages as well, so air distribution suffered, heat distribution suffered, light distribution suffered, and created shadows because the ceiling was just above basically where the starter cages were. So if your light bulbs are there, we tended to have a lot of shadows that would show up because of the spacing of the light bulbs. So assumptions were made over the years that these were the problems. And the Band-Aid method, of course, was you live with it and you supply extra chicks or replacements. We tried chicks from older breeders, so we ended up with larger chicks, and it did help to a degree. So did higher wattage light bulbs. They helped a little bit. Super booster was one of the few things that could work, but through HACCP reasons, we were unable to run it aside from just the one flock. And this table kind of gives you an idea of what was happening in that pullet barn. We can see by these 14-day mortality numbers that they're all generally high. Even where we ran the super booster and had 3.2% mortality, that is still high. In the end, the new cages did solve the problem where we got it to drop below 1%, but that's an expensive fix. But through this, in the beginning, we ran water tests for HACCP reasons, which every farm basically has to do anyway to show that the water coming into the barn is clean. So we had less than 1 CFU of E. coli, which is basically saying 0, and only a couple of CFUs of coliform, which is not alarming. Most of the time, the provincial standards will call for anything over 100 as being a bit of an issue. When we took water, I took water samples in the starter cages after the chicks had been in for a little while, and that sample was showing up as 11 CFUs of the E. coli, 20 of coliform, which is not that significant, but the fact that there was E. coli in there was signifying that we did have a problem in that level. And because the birds have been drinking for a while, they had, for a few days, they had been able to drain off some of the water in the system. But the water in the second level, which is when you start off in a pullet barn, you start them off on the highest point so that where the heat is, and then after a few weeks, you move them down to the next level. So I took some water samples in there before the chicks went in the second level, and found E. coli as high as 261 CFUs, and the lab can only measure up to 2,420 CFUs of coliform. So this water was a significant problem. And why was this? Well, in this case, it was the equipment, not the cages themselves. It was the type of watering system that was installed at that time, which was considered modern. This is not an exact picture of what exactly was in the barn, but this is a good indication of the type of watering system. This is actually the exact type of watering system that was in that barn. We can see hoses coming down off of the main pipe down to the nipples, and you can flush water all you want, but unless you trigger all those nipples individually and drain the water out of each hose, there will always be an area that if you have anything building up at 35, 36 degrees Celsius, it doesn't take long for bacteria to really thrive and do well. And this was shown in, when we look at E. coli in itself and look at some of the basics of it, it reproduces through binary fission, which is basically where one cell breaks off from the other. And a lot of us have seen videos of how bacteria does this. So you basically end up with 2 cells that are very identical. And this takes place every 15 to 20 minutes. So every 15 to 20 minutes, that one cell becomes 2, which becomes 4, and so on and so forth. So after 8 hours, we can end up with 10 to 16 million cells given the right conditions. And the right conditions are certainly in a pullet barn or a startup in a breeder barn or a broiler barn where you have higher temperatures. The bacteria will do very well. It does have the ability to use iron from the hard water for energy, and it can adapt to slightly acidic conditions, but it thrives when the water is at neutral. And there are only some types that are harmful of E. coli. E. coli is a general term for a bacteria line, and ones like the 157H7, which made headlines again recently because we had some lettuce coming out of Arizona that was under irrigation that was causing some issues up here. But we need to get it serotyped to actually figure out which one it is. But most of the provinces have just said that anything that E. coli has to be less than 1 CFU in drinking water to be safe. And that's just to cover everything, because some are bad, some are good. This covers everything that we don't have any in our system. E. coli can lead to colibacillosis, which basically says that it turns into an infection. In broilers, it can congregate as cellulitis if it moves through the system, which is, condemns because there's an infection in the skin. Breeders, broiler breeders, leghorn breeders can spread this through their droppings because E. coli is basically a fecal type of bacteria. If that gets onto the eggs, it leads to omphalitis in chicks. It can also lead to respiratory in any type of poultry, whether it be turkeys, broilers, or leghorns, because it can move through the dust as the manure dries up and it spreads through the air. Coliforms, it's a broad term saying bacteria, which is almost any type of gram-negative bacteria, but gram-negative also includes E. coli, Campylobacter, and Pseudomonas, which a lot of us have heard these terms. Most of them are not good for humans or animals. Anything over 100 CFUs is somewhat concerning, that we should be looking at where the problem is and what type of bacteria, possibly through testing. Some of these organisms can actually move upstream. If it's a slower water flow, they have the ability to cling on to micro cracks in the water system, which therefore becomes biofilm as the cells reproduce and die, and they prevent the water from getting at the cells underneath. And there can be numerous types of bacteria that build up in these colonies of biofilm. In my second case study, the farmer had called and said the birds are pecking, they're killing each other through cannibalism. You're not going to get the next order because it's a bird problem. So I'd been up there previously and had fixed up his LED light problem for the most part. But mortality was showing when on the phone call, feathers were missing. There was signs of vent trauma. Urates were building up around the vent, as well as the odd part was they had vent scabs, which meant that they were somehow, they must have been pecking at each other's vent and bleeding off, obviously. But mortality was centralized to a small area. So in going into the barn, I went through the FLA, which feed, light, air were all normal. We looked at water. Water was being flushed weekly. So, we're down to only a few things left to look at. So we, sometimes what we do is say the 5-gallon pail method, where you just sit there and listen and watch and observe, which is what we did. So there was a few cages where there was only a couple of birds left. After a couple of minutes, we actually found that when the birds had calmed down and resumed their normal activity, they were actually picking at their own vents, which indicates obviously some kind of major irritation going on in there. But again, why? We pulled the nipples off the water line and the water flowed normally. It's a low flow system with 300 or 3/4 PSI. But when the dismantling of the regulator occurred, we found that there was buildup in there and that the regulator wasn't working properly. It was partially plugged. So the water at the low flow of 3/4 PSI could go normally, but when you ran the flush lines, which would normally be anywhere from 40 to 60 PSI, it wouldn't go through that one regulator. So in the end, when he fixed the regulator, flushed the line, the problem was solved and our bird went in again. But again, it's that whole process of going through one thing at a time to make sure that you get to the end, which is the conclusion. And the water sample that I took it confirmed what we had seen. Coliform count was higher than 2,420. E. coli was basically 0. So, but this indicated that there was some type of bacteria in there that was getting into the bird system and irritating them enough to actually go to the point of cannibalism. And as you can see by all the ones on the side there, all the results, I have I could do numerous case studies on what I've seen over the years. Many farmers have heard me say 99% of the water coming into the barn is good, which we do for HACCP reasons, of course, but I care more about what they're drinking, what the birds themselves are drinking. And so each one of these is their own case study. If you could see some of the numbers on there, some of them are very close to what you would see coming out of basically raw sewage. And this is what we were expecting them to drink. So in conclusion, never assume. Bad thing to do. Test. It's cheap to do water tests if you see something going on. It is better to prevent than react because dead birds do not lay eggs. They do not make delicious chicken wings, or will they make it to Thanksgiving dinner? If you won't drink the water in the barn that the birds are drinking, why should they have to drink that same water? It's not fair to them. So in conclusion, have a great day, and we'll leave it open for questions.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another talk on water. As you know, since we started the Western Poultry Conference, we've pretty much had a water talk every year. And I gotta compliment you guys for a lot of progress has been made. Pretty much everybody is using a product for either disinfecting the water or acidifying the water these days. And because we've made some progress, now we're actually running into some other situations where every so once in a while something will sneak by on the radar. Such is the case with the story I'd like to share with you this morning. Here we had a farm and everything was going tickety-boo. As you can see in the next slide, average results, body weight 2.23, feed conversion 1.65, perhaps today even a bit below average, but certainly average results. What happened next? Body weights actually increased the next couple of flocks before they started to tumble. But unfortunately, feed conversion started to rise quite significantly. In order to diagnose what's going on, I'd like to start from the beginning. What happened in that first 7 critical days after placement? And so the next flock that was placed, we monitored it, and certainly nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Everything seemed to be going just well. So let's look at some more data then. Feed intakes. And as you can see, I did a before and after just so that it doesn't look so busy. So the blue and the gray lines are the before and after flocks, and the orange line is the flock right in the middle when things weren't going so well. And as you can see, things started to drop off at about that day 25 mark. The same thing we see here with water intakes. So there's 2 things that happen here that we then started looking at. At about day 24, day 25, the diet increases from a 25% wheat inclusion to a 40% wheat inclusion. And we knew that the harvest in the prior fall came off quite wet. So we sent in wheat samples for toxicity tests as well as moisture tests, and they came back good. The next thing then that would be suspicious in that time frame is perhaps there was some cocci going on. So we decided to change the ionophore in the next flock, and unfortunately we didn't get a positive response. So the flock after that, we decided to go to a chemical program, and again the results were very similar. So that's when we decided to test the water. And I got to tell you, the reason why we initially didn't look at water as such is because this particular farm had run for at least 5 years straight. Every year when they send in their coliform test for their quality assurance, it came back negative. Plus they're using chlorine dioxide to disinfect the water. So it really wasn't suspicious. As well as if there was something going on, we would have expected trouble earlier on in the flock. Mortalities had stayed pretty much flat, and if you place in a 34°C barn, you know that your water is going to be about the same temperature. So if there was a bacteria issue, we would have expected that to happen earlier. Unfortunately, we were all wrong, as you can see what the water test revealed to us. So here we go, 2 barns tested, and we definitely got something going on. So then we went back in and we wanted to see if the contamination actually, or the bacteria levels came from the well or if they came from the holding tank. So the well was clean and the holding tank was not. That's when we put together a plan to clean this up. And first, of course, we drained the holding tank, pressure washed it out, disinfected it, and then refilled it. The luxury is that when you have broiler flocks, you can actually do this because you do it between flocks. Some rigorous flushing was done, and then also a new chlorine dioxide pump was put in because these days these newer pumps, they're much more accurate in their dosing and their adjustments. So decided to start with a clean brand new pump, and away we go. And as you can see, this made a lot of difference. Body weights came right back up to where they used to be from our benchmark flock, and feed conversions came down drastically again to more normal levels. So 2 things that I'd like to emphasize as lessons learned. And one of the examples I want to give you, if you take a flock of 10,000 birds and are able to decrease the feed conversion by 0.05 points, which is not a whole lot, at an average of $380 a ton for feed, which is old times, I know. Hopefully they will come back soon. Won't be for the next few months, but it will eventually come down a bit, I would think. This gives you a net profit of $456. The water test that we took to determine what was going on cost us $120. So my point is, it does pay to perhaps test your water more than once a year in order to prevent some of these things that happened in this particular farm. The losses were definitely far greater, and so I think that's one of the things that you need to keep in mind. The other thing about it is you can take a water sample, and that water would have looked clear in the bottle, as clear as anything. And this is why I titled my presentation, Termites in Water. In any wooden structure, when termites are at work, it's hard for us to detect that they're there. The same thing is true for our water. We could have some critters that could really seriously affect our profits, and therefore we should continuously pay attention to our water. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much, Perry and Art. Really some interesting, I guess you could almost call it detective work that you both had to do in some of these case studies, CSI, or I guess poultry investigations, to track it back to water. Perry, would you say that sometimes maybe water is overlooked? Like, we've got these minimum standards to get our quality assurance, but do we often need to go deeper if we want to get better performance from our water and using that as a factor? Perry, I think I need your audio.
Yeah, sorry,
There we go. That old mute button gets us all.
Because we have a separate speaker, it was running through a different speaker, and we got it all
No
fixed
problem.
now. Sorry, what was the question again?
So just kind of looking at water, we have minimum control standards. We can still get our quality control with water tested at source, but, do we need to dig deeper? And is that what you guys really found in your case studies?
I think that was a big part of it, was being able to go in and actually test water in the lines. I always like to pick the barn at the back of the barn where the water flow is the least, and take a sample from there and run it in. Producers will often say, well, don't take that water, it's dirty. Well, I don't care. That's the stuff that the birds are drinking. And that's where we can often learn a lot about certainly how often we should be flushing if there's water treatment involved. I noticed one of the questions was about how often to flush. I would say every day, but not everybody has that ability to do it, but certainly weekly, and making sure that all of the regulators and the lines and everything are performing as they should.
Okay.
But using the flaws method is a great way to do the further investigation.
Art, do you want to add on to that? And I guess too, it's not just in the lines, but right in the nipples where the problems can come as well.
Yeah, no, Perry covered it pretty well. Yeah, one of the areas that's also often overlooked is these regulators, and Perry referred to that earlier. Even though we flush, we still have to remember that there's still a buildup that can still exist in the regulators. And I know Susan Watkins had a great talk last year, and she mentioned this, and I've had a lot of my customers open them up. And what was really interesting in the farm example that I just used, we did that, and the regulators were spotless. So yeah, we were really sent on a mission on that particular farm. And that's why I wanted to highlight it today.
Okay, we've got some questions starting to come in. Dennis is asking, are there any acceptable limits for a few bacteria?
No.
Zero tolerance, is that what you're saying, Art?
Yes, because how can we ever rule out whether water played a factor if we say, well, perhaps, a few might not be so bad. As a matter of fact, and I can't go back, but if you looked at the second barn where the test came back, and it wasn't actually it wasn't so bad as such. The numbers weren't so bad. That barn actually performed the worst throughout this whole thing. So no, the answer is absolutely zero, none.
Perry, I'm guessing you would concur?
I would concur, definitely, because I've seen enough water samples. There are some labs that have certainly serotyped them. And when I look through the list, and even though there's only 1 or 2 CFUs, some of them are quite alarming of what's in there actually.
Okay, some more questions coming in. Did you check for chlorine dioxide levels in the storage tank versus the end of the nipple line?
Yeah, so prior to all these things that occurred, they were using the strips to monitor residual chlorine dioxide levels. And we did go away from that as well and got an actual chlorine dioxide tester, and are testing weekly now at the end of the line. We're not concerned what happens in the holding tank. We know that the levels have to be right at the end of the line, and we're getting good residuals all the time now.
Okay, at what pH do we see the best feed conversion? Anybody want to try that? Perry?
Well, because a lot of people acidify their water. Certainly the good bacteria do better in acidified waters. Certainly the ones like Salmonella, Campylobacter, Pseudomonas actually do better in alkali type water. Sorry, I'm not sure why my video is not working, but so certainly, making sure that our pH is set very well makes a big difference. Alkali water also does not help. I've seen some people use it for water vaccines. Vaccines don't live well in water with high alkali levels. So I would say something that neutral or slightly below neutral matches up well with a bird's gut, because a bird's gut is actually quite low in pH, and it increases in pH as it goes through the system. So it better matches what's happening in the bird system itself with we don't need pHs of 2 or 3 a lot. I think certainly in that 4 or 5 range seems to work a little bit better. There's a lot of, well, even chlorine and chlorine dioxide will work better in slightly acidified water as well. Works better.
Yeah, now that kind of relates to one other question about your experiences increasing the water disinfectant, chlorine, chlorine dioxide, peroxide. Is that a potential for controlling a respiratory disease at all?
Well, it's good for controlling any type of bacteria, but you never assume just because it's running into the lines that you actually are getting the right levels, because I was visiting some barns yesterday where I was testing chlorine dioxide levels, and 2 out of 3 barns were showing perfect levels, but we were putting in what we thought was the same amount into the 3rd barn, but the 3rd barn actually had a slightly newer medicator with different controls. Therefore, the amount that was going into the system showed up as 0. And when I'd done a bacteria sample on that one last week, and it was showing a very high level of coliform, but we assumed that everything was working. So yes, even myself can assume once in a while. So never do that.
And that's your message too, right, Art?
That's my message.
Yes.
Yeah.
Art, anything you want to add on either of those points?
Well, as far as pH is concerned, to sort data specifically for, which pH will get you your best CFR or FCR, sorry. We got to remember that there's a lot more that goes into feed conversion, bird health, even the breeder age going in can affect that. We've got feed going in. So all these factors combined, barn management, ventilation, so forth, all determine the outcome as far as what your feed conversion is going to look like. So to sort data specifically on, which is the best pH, it'll be hard. Maybe in time with our new artificial intelligence programs that are being created, we might get there, but I think today we're not there to sort such things.
And anything else on the chlorine and some of those others for preventing disease?
Well, certainly keeping your water as clean as possible is going to be a positive thing for any disease that might be floating around. The other thing I would like to add to that is we've got to start thinking about rotation of disinfectant products as well, because there are some bacteria that are actually starting to build up resistance. And I'm starting to run into a few issues where, working with the chemist, they've actually recommended we switch to different products just to break the cycle.
All right, good point. All right, at what point of acidification do the birds back off of water is one of the questions that just come in. Have either of you had any experience with that on the acidification? Is there a point in there where birds will back off on the water?
It varies. I have seen it. And so when we talk about acidification, the amount of acid that's required to be added depends on what the buffering capacity of the water is. And so if the buffering capacity of the water is really high, you got to add a lot more acid in order to bring the pH down. And there is a balance point there where we're getting too much acid in the water that affects the taste in a negative way, and then birds will back off. And unfortunately, it varies from farm to farm. On some farms, it can be as low as pH of 3.6, and on other farms, it can be as high as a pH of 5.5, where birds are starting to back off.
So variance. Perry, anything else in your experience on that?
No, I think Art has a lot more experience with it than I do. Because my work that I do with this is predominantly done in Manitoba. We traditionally run, a lot of the province has deep wells where we get water that is very close to neutral. But once you get out west, there's a lot more shallow wells or water that goes with city water, town water, or from dugouts. That water tends to be a lot more volatile in that it depends a lot on the season and the amount of moisture that is present, because the levels can fluctuate all over the map. So it almost needs to be tested on a regular basis.
That's right. All right. Dennis is saying, are there, and maybe this goes back to what we've talked about a little bit earlier, but what is an acceptable limit for Bacillus species? And I'll give it a try. Strenotrophomonas maltophilia. Was that close?
That is probably something that's best left to some kind of chemist or water expert. Certainly, because I'm a bit of a groupie of Dr. Susan Watkins, and there's a lot of her talks that actually may be able to deal with more specifics. I don't usually deal in specifics. I'm a very practical person.
Art, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. Like really, as servicemen, it's our job to figure out what's going on when we're presented with a problem. And it's the same as if there's, birds dying, well, then we have to rely on a veterinarian, such as Victor, who spoke earlier, to give us that information. And it's the same, when there's a bacteria challenge going on. I do talk to chemists quite regularly when we're doing barn swabs and we've got something unusual coming back. And then I rely on their advice as to what the best treatment would be for these cases.
All right, so another question here. I think, Perry, you dealt with it a little bit, but maybe Art will give you a crack at this one. How often should I flush the water lines in a layer barn?
Thought I was going to let Perry answer that. He's the layer expert.
We kind of answered it a little bit earlier, so I was going to give you first shot at this one.
Well, the one thing we got to remember is when we're saying how often should we flush the barn in a layer barn, it depends on the age of the birds. So if we're talking pullets here, we got to remember that the first 3 days, they cannot regulate their body temperature very well. So the more often that we flush and cool that water down, and then they have a drink of it, it increases the stress level. And we just seen a phenomenal presentation from Sarah on this, what happens when we introduce stress, especially if we introduce it in a young animal. As far as down the road, they love drinking cooler water, actually, the older the birds get. So if you want to flush once a day, go for it, because again, it's going to clean things up, give them a fresh start for that particular day.
Okay, Perry, anything you want to add on that?
Well, biofilm itself, even if you have perfectly clean water lines, can build up very quickly with, you saw my rate of reproduction of the E. coli cells. A lot of other bacteria can reproduce just as fast, if not faster. So those are the ones that if they do cling on to somewhere in the pipe and become biofilm, that can happen in as little as 16 hours or 24 hours, where you can start having a buildup again. So certainly taking swabs is a good way to find out if there's anything building up on the insides of the water lines themselves.
All right, I loved your example, Perry, about the water bucket, sitting there and observing. I mean, nowadays we've got, as Art mentioned, some of this AI, we've got a lot of tech ways of measuring things in the barn. Why was it important to sit and observe? And is that still an important skill in today's modern technical poultry operations? I'll let you start on that, Perry, and then we'll go to Art.
Okay. Well, I think it's probably more important than anything now, because a lot of these barns, even our own breeder barns, we have very good controls in them. We can have all the video cameras and everything else where we monitor the birds constantly, but you only have those few points that you're actually monitoring. So to get in and look around in a broiler, whether it's in a broiler barn, turkey barn, particularly now with the aviary barns for layers, for pullets and for the layers themselves, it's good to actually observe what's going on, because you could potentially spot a problem before it flares up and causes some kind of economic or even worse loss to the birds themselves. So yeah, I do agree. It's even more important today.
And Art, I think we've talked about this. It's kind of animal husbandry, that's still a very valuable skill.
Yeah, one of the things that we need to remember that just like there is no two human beings alike, there is no two broiler chickens or layer chickens or turkeys or broiler breeders alike. And so we can have all kinds of controls in place to manage. But just as human nature tends to change, chicken nature for that matter, it changes too. And so your next flock might react totally different. It could, and there's a big factor that plays into it is the weather as well. If we get some storms happening, they might be in the barn and there might be dark outs, but they will react differently. One of the things that's also, I should just add for knowledge sake here, is there's some really cool studies that are starting to happen now about the rhythm. So broilers will actually perform in a rhythm, and it's about a 30-minute cycle. So if you want to get a good idea of what's going on, is go and sit in the barn every day for 30 minutes, and you'll follow them through the whole cycle that they go through continuously in the barn.
And then you can spot if there's anything not going according to what it should be or any potential problems.
Yep.
And Mike chimes in saying, of course, that humans have better senses than electronics. We wouldn't want to do without electronics, but humans have good senses. Let's talk just a minute here to wrap up. We'll give you one more question or one more opportunity for questions, and then we'll close her down. But Art, when we think about performance, we can get that quality measurement and we can get to that level and think we're doing good, but do we sometimes need to do better than good if we want to get that performance from the birds?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do understand there's a lot these days to look at as well, because our all the management tools that we're adding, such as ventilation controls and so forth. Number one is you need to be very well educated as such, because what's really interesting is a lot of that technology comes from Europe. And once you install it in a barn in Alberta, it has never heard of a Chinook wind coming into town. And
what? They don't have Chinooks in Europe?
No, they don't. And then what happens is they actually panic because they see the temperature outside rising faster than what they're programmed for, and they start to do all kinds of unique things. So I'd say today versus 10 years ago, 15 years ago, before we had all this technology, we need to be even more vigilant at looking at all the little nuances that change throughout today. Be it even like, for that matter, feed changes. Just changing the diet up a little bit, changing the taste, it might affect their performance.
And Perry, I guess water quality is one of those things that you just can't get by on. You have to do better than get by.
Yeah, you can, as I mentioned in my talk, you can take all the water samples you want to coming into the barn. We always do something about that if there's a problem, but nobody ever nobody ever goes into the barn. I'll go into our breeder barns and I'll take water right from the nipples at the end, and I'll drink from it, because if I can't take it, then why should they?
Good point. Just one more point that's come in. What about changing the filters? Some surprise that maybe changing filters never came up. Is that an important thing to consider when you're checking your water quality as well?
Yeah, very important, because especially in those filter housings, as they're starting to accumulate stuff, that's where stuff can start to multiply as well, depending on what the temperature is of the room where you have these filters. So very important to change filters. Again, you almost can't do it often enough. It's like the more often you do it, the better it is.
And like you said, Art and Perry, I'm sure you'd agree that those are maybe simple, very relatively low cost things that can make a big difference on the return end of the equation.
Well, very much so. And even going back to the filters only go to a certain micron, whereas I have yet to see a bacteria that's a big enough micron to get stopped by any filter. So that's something worth considering too, that, you know, like Art said, maybe we shouldn't be just replacing the filter. We could look at cleaning out the housing right away too that it sits in, because that water's in there all the time, and some of it looks pretty grungy by the time the filter gets changed.
All right. And Mike assures us that he still needs electronic monitoring. Doesn't want to give up on that altogether, but it's that blend that we can't forget the human AI as well. Any last words from either of you? Just everybody go home and check your water, because if you've got mysterious problems, it could come back to something as basic as water.
Yeah, my advice would be is don't hit the pillow tonight before you have checked your water inside out.
Perry?
I would say, if nothing else, go in, take a cup of water, take a drink, and see how you do in the morning. You'll know if your water's good or not.